Okay, hi and welcome everyone to the short course for SharePoint 2013 development. My name is Brian Farnhill. I'm going to be the lecturer for this particular course, and this is the week 1 lecture for what is SharePoint. Before we get started, just a little bit of an introduction about who I am. I'm an independent SharePoint consultant. I'm based in Canberra in the ACT in Australia. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP. I've been awarded that for the last 4 years running now from Microsoft. I help organise a number of community events in and around Australia, such as the SharePoint Saturdays in Australia, and I also help run the Canberra SharePoint user group. I've been working with SharePoint since around about, late SharePoint 2003, but really got started with SharePoint 2007, so I've been working with it for a number of years. My prior background before I was doing SharePoint was around ASP.NET development. And if you look further back than that, you see a few things like Cold Fusion and some other web-based systems, but have spent the majority of my years focusing on Microsoft technologies, the Microsoft stack. And last but certainly not least, I'm an industry-based lecturer for Charles Sturt University, which is why I'll be leading this short course. So what we're aiming to get for you guys out of this short course is a taster of what it's like to study the master's degree at Charles Sturt University. So this is part of a new subject. It's ITE 519, SharePoint 2013 development, and this will be the first time that it's run. And this is part of the Master of Systems Development. So if you're interested in looking at the full course after you've had this sample of the short course, all the information's on the Charles Sturt website at www.csu.edu.au. So you can get all the information you need from there. So the structure of what we're doing here in the short course is that each week we're going to have a webinar, which will include a lecture and a workshop, and we'll be recording those and sharing the recordings online so you can get to them later. I'll be providing you with some labs and some things that you guys can go away and try. I will also be providing you with some study materials, so things that you can go and read on the internet and blogs and MSDN and TechNet and that sort of thing. And at the end of the 4 weeks, we'll be having a final exam to test your knowledge on what you've learned out of these 4 weeks. There's probably about 8 to 12 hours worth of study and labs per week for you guys to play around with and hopefully learn from, and hopefully you'll be able to get something out of the course here. So the content that we're delivering over this 4 weeks worth of lectures is what is SharePoint for tonight's lecture for the first week, developing for SharePoint in week 2. So get hands-on with the development tools and writing some code. Week 3, we're going to talk about creating web parts and get into a deep dive session on how web parts work in SharePoint. Week 4, we're going to go into building apps for SharePoint, the new app development platform that exists for SharePoint 2013, and we'll finish it up in the 5th week with the exam. Now, textbooks, there aren't any that are strictly required. All the study materials I'll be providing links for are stuff that is freely available, but these will be the 2 textbooks that are going to get mentioned in the full version of the course, and I thought they were worth mentioning here. Beginning SharePoint 2013 Development by Steve Fox, Chris Johnson, and Donovan Follett is a great book if you're interested in doing app development for SharePoint 2013. Focuses very heavily on the new app model. And the Microsoft SharePoint 2013 Developer Reference by Paolo Pialorzi is a good all-round book around development for SharePoint, including the server-side components as well as some of the app stuff and workflow, and a good sort of general coverage book for developing for SharePoint 2013. So to kick things off, what is SharePoint? If you go and ask someone what SharePoint is, they'll give you one answer. You can go and ask a second person and go and get a completely different answer, and keep asking around and keep getting these different responses based on people's own experiences with SharePoint. The fact is that SharePoint does a very large number of things, and depending on how it's been implemented in any one deployment, you're going to get different answers from different people about exactly what it is that SharePoint does. So what we're trying to do out of this first lecture is get you guys around some of the features of SharePoint and what it can do, what it can't do, and how we as developers can learn from what they've done with SharePoint to be able to extend it effectively and create custom solutions. What is SharePoint according to Microsoft? So this is the marketing line that went along with SharePoint 2010, in that SharePoint is the business collaboration platform for the enterprise and the web. So that was the tagline for SharePoint 2010. So SharePoint at its heart has always been a collaboration tool. It's always been about making life easier for people when they're doing work, right? Making working together a simpler task. But of recent times, in the last couple of releases, there's been more of a drive towards what's happening on the web, more of a drive towards what's happening outside of your enterprise and working with people around you. And there's some exciting new features in what's happening in SharePoint 2013 that are going to facilitate these sorts of things. So it can be hard to define exactly what SharePoint is. I mean, I know when somebody says to me, hey, what do you do? And I'm a SharePoint guy. Oh, what's SharePoint? The answer that follows is usually fairly vague because it takes a lot more than 30 to 60 seconds to actually explain what SharePoint is and have it be a meaningful response. But hopefully we'll get something out of this first week and get you guys around it. So starting off with a little bit of history of the platform. SharePoint Portal Server 2001. This is really where SharePoint began. It was a basic document management system. It had indexing, it had search, but it was a step for Microsoft into what was the emerging portals market. It had announcements and teams and news sites and this basic portal functionality. It did have limited abilities for development, and it also had some pretty big scalability issues, which made it a problem for bigger enterprises to be able to adopt. And SharePoint 2003. So what we've got here is the next release of SharePoint. It had a few more features around the portal space. It had better structures. It had dashboards. Features like workflow didn't make the cut for SharePoint 2003 really. The focus was really around getting the stability right and scalability and working the back-end services like SQL Server into the piece. We did begin to see some things like personalization, integration with Office and Office 2003 to get some better stories out around what's happening in the document management space and the processes that people are going through to actually collaborate and the tools that they're using. Development was more of an option here, given that it was all based on ASP.NET, which had been recently released before that, and the platform was there to be able to start extending it because of the fact that it was based on ASP.NET and those standard processes and things that we could do. So SharePoint 2007 was the next release. It was Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, which was where the MOS acronym first started turning up from. As I mentioned earlier, this was the first version that I started getting really sort of involved with. And there was a bunch of new feature areas that came in with SharePoint 2007. Records management was becoming more of a focus in the industry at the time, and SharePoint brought a bunch of features to the table and what it did in the electronic records management space. Web content management and public-facing websites was also another big area for SharePoint at the time, and there was some dots starting to get connected between what was happening in the portal space and the web content management space. So the feature set that came with SharePoint 2007 around there had a lot of similarities there. We saw an offline synchronization story begin with what happened with Groove, which was a company Microsoft had purchased previously. It was a peer-to-peer tool before that, and it went on to become SharePoint Workspace. We got Workflow in this version of SharePoint, which was based on Windows Workflow Foundation in .NET Framework. There was a lot of new feature stacks in general that made their way into this release. We had blogs, we had Excel services, we had InfoPath, wikis, My Sites, analytics, and so much more. The good thing with this release, though, is the development experience in that we got a much richer development framework from Microsoft with what we could do to extend and create solutions for SharePoint and the processes and guidance that have been provided there around being able to create some bigger and more robust solutions running inside of SharePoint. It did still have a fairly steep learning curve to get your head around, though, from a development perspective for someone who just learnt ASP.NET and wanted to get into development for SharePoint. So, continuing on. So, SharePoint 2010. So this is the product that's been out and has been up until recently, the current version of the product. It's only recently been replaced by SharePoint 2013. It was sort of consolidating a lot on what SharePoint did well in the document management space in particular, and sort of really started to enhance some of those stories. Workflow, document management, records management, they all got new updates. This was the first version where we saw Office web applications, and they were added to this release. The business connectivity services, which was formerly the business data catalog, also got some updates to be able to update external systems from within SharePoint. And so you start looking at scenarios where SharePoint was more of a hub for updating these back-end systems rather than just consuming information. There was a lot of architectural changes in SharePoint 2010 to be able to help that scalability story, but also to provide better options around the cloud and hosting story, because this is sort of the point where the cloud was becoming a bit bigger of a thing, and Microsoft had at Office 365, which was starting to gain a bit of traction as well, and their own cloud story for SharePoint. There were some other changes around authentication, where a claims-based system was implemented in SharePoint 2010, and yet again the development tooling got improved again. And there was a bit of a focus on really trying to reduce that learning curve on what it took to become a SharePoint developer and go from doing just regular ASP.NET into doing SharePoint. And the tools that Microsoft provided really backed that one up. And there was a couple of other things that got added in around how we can do development with SharePoint 2010 in the form of sandbox solutions and being able to write code that can run in the cloud in a safe and scalable way. And again, just lots of little tweaks and whatnot that ran in with that one as well. But here we are today, SharePoint 2013, the current release of the product. It was officially hit RTM earlier this year, and it really is ready to rock and roll with what's going on in the cloud. The new app model is one of the biggest changes for us as developers to be able to look at, in which we can create apps that integrate into SharePoint but no longer run on the SharePoint server. We'll talk more about this in week 4 about how the whole app model works. There was lots of functionality that got redesigned to work and scale out really well and facilitate cloud-based operations, things like the new workflow engine, web service integrations. There's been a big adoption of standard web protocols with things like OAuth, OData, REST, JSON, and a lot of richer functionality went in around creating public-facing websites and how we can work with those. The developer tooling again became better. We got better visual designers for a lot of the things where we had to previously hand code XML and that sort of thing. But the biggest change with SharePoint 2013 is that if you're working on just the app development side, is you no longer need to have SharePoint running locally to be able to compile. We can actually run our Visual Studio wherever we want and have SharePoint be remote, or even use Office 365 to develop against. Whereas with every previous version of SharePoint required running a virtual machine and installing Visual Studio on that and using that to be able to get your development going. So a bit of an overview and starting to dive into features specifically within SharePoint 2013. If you've ever sat through a marketing presentation from Microsoft for any other version of SharePoint, you would have seen undoubtedly what's been commonly referred to as the SharePoint pie, just this big circle with a bunch of words around it of things that SharePoint does. They sort of ditched the circle for SharePoint 2013 and came up with this. But this is more or less the same sort of concept of trying to highlight the key areas that they want to be able to work with within SharePoint. And these were share, organize, discover, build, and manage. So these are the sort of workloads that Microsoft want to pitch to. We had another question come in there that I saw around the relevance of SharePoint Designer in the development history. So just going back over that, SharePoint Designer was actually front page previously before it became SharePoint Designer. So with up to SharePoint 2003, it was front page and didn't really have much integration into SharePoint. When SharePoint 2007 came out, SharePoint Designer was essentially born and front page was retired, and it started to evolve from there. So SharePoint Designer in 2007 looked very much so like the old front page product, and with the 2010 release, it became a little bit more of an independent SharePoint tool. With SharePoint 2013, it's gone and changed again in that it is still fundamentally the same sort of tool for being able to manage SharePoint and what's going on in there. But this time around, they've taken the design view out, so you get just code-based views instead of the visual previews of what you were working on previously. So it is a bit of a different tool. It is geared much so towards the developers this time around than the design story that it had previously. Another couple of questions that came in there is InfoPath still part of SharePoint? Yes, very much so. InfoPath was introduced in 2003, I believe, and has been in the product since. There's some interesting blog posts around on the internet at the moment about what is happening with InfoPath and the future of the tool. In that, if you look at what it was in SharePoint 2010 and what it currently is in SharePoint 2013, there was little to no investment in changing InfoPath or upgrading it or making it any better. There's been nothing announced from Microsoft as far as what the future direction of the tool is, but for the time being, it is still part of SharePoint and can still be used in exactly the same way that it was in SharePoint 2010. Getting questions regarding InfoPath further than that around development of InfoPath 2013, not greatly enhanced versus Nintex. Yeah, honestly, if you were still looking for some of the form stuff at the moment, I would probably be looking at some of the third-party tools. There's a really good blog post that was written by a guy named Andrew Connell who sort of addresses some of these InfoPath things and what your options are going forward. I'll get the link to that particular blog post and I'll put it up onto the portal afterwards so you can go and have a read of that over the notes. Does my client still need InfoPath if I design using it? No, you can use InfoPath services and they can access it through a web browser, so that's fine. And is SharePoint Designer in 2013 because the audio cut out at the time? Yes, SharePoint Designer does have a 2013 release. Okay, so caught up on all the questions. Let's continue on. Okay, so starting to look at these individual stacks and rattle through some of the features. Starting with Share, because it's part of the name of the product, SharePoint. It's 2013 saw a really big rework as far as what's happening in the social space. You've got a massive rework, the new newsfeed, the new My Sites, the new user profiles. The social parts of SharePoint really have been driven greatly towards the center of the product, and they play a very big part in what's going on in the rest of SharePoint. And it's going to be an interesting story for customers who are looking at using the social features within SharePoint that aren't already, as far as the kind of value they can get out of it with the 2013 release. Other things to look at in this space are the sharing of documents, obviously, so the bread and butter of what SharePoint's been able to do. But with tools like the Office web applications and what we'd be able to do with sharing through extranets and things like that, the walls of the enterprise are becoming less of a thing, and we can start working with people outside of our organizations in just as easy a way as we've used to for working with people inside our organization. And yeah, anywhere, anytime. So working with content on mobile devices has been a bit of a driver with 2013, particularly in the Office web app space. I've recently gone back myself to using an iPad, and I've been able to use the Office web apps in 2013 to be able to update slide decks and Word documents straight through the browser much easier than ever before, to the point where I now don't even have an Office-specific app on my iPad. I just use the web browser. But there's some really good stories for being able to view documents within SharePoint and SharePoint Online within the web browser, and a focus on targeting any device and using those standards of HTML5 and JavaScript and things that are designed to run anywhere to be able to create that experience. Another couple of questions coming in. Is SharePoint to have a build database? I'm not quite sure on what that question is, so we might come back to that later. Yammer component. So Yammer, for those who haven't heard of it, is a social platform that creates some newsfeed experiences and groups and some really nice social features. Microsoft acquired the company a year or two ago. There's been steps to begin integrating Yammer into SharePoint, but as far as 2013 goes, there's nothing directly there as far as what the Yammer story is at the moment. There is some information on Microsoft's website about the product and what they're doing with it, but at the moment 2013 and the social features it has stand alone, and they aren't directly tied to Yammer yet. Regarding sharing of documents, is SkyDrive relevant in this space? Yes. SkyDrive Pro is a separate app to the SkyDrive Consumer app. They both have the same name, but they have slightly different purposes. SkyDrive Pro will allow me to sync content to and from my SharePoint 2013 sites in much the same way as the Consumer SkyDrive app does. And is there any security concerns if I'm publishing an InfoPath form in the internet? There are some issues there around actually using an InfoPath form on the internet as far as authenticating your users. And what you're doing with that. So as in anonymous forms and InfoPath, there's some issues there from a technical standpoint, but there's no direct security concerns as long as your users are logged in and submitting forms. Okay, so continuing along. The next area I'm going to focus on is the organizing area. So again, what's changed in the 2013 release and what's been improved, the task management has got a lot of work. So we now have a true roll-up of tasks from across all of SharePoint, Exchange, and Project Server, and they can all now be rolled up down into my site. So when I look at my site, I can now see all the tasks that I've got assigned to me across SharePoint within my personal lists within Exchange from Project Server, all in one list, rather than needing to remember to go to specific places to see specific sets of tasks that are assigned to me. The team sites got a bunch of improvements, so things like team notebooks are now being provisioned into the sites. Team mailboxes tie in with the new version of Exchange to be able to create a better story around integrating email into SharePoint and bringing mail messages into these team sites. And as I mentioned with the question earlier, SkyDrive Pro and being able to use that to be able to sync content offline. So this is essentially replacing what was SharePoint Workspace. So if you've installed Office 2013, you'll notice that there isn't a SharePoint Workspace part in there anymore. SkyDrive Pro is the story looking forward for syncing content offline and going back into SharePoint. So Discover. Basically, what we've got in this area is around the search story, and finding experts easier is one of the big areas here that got changed. So the people search got a bit of an overhaul, so that it's now based on actual use within SharePoint. So previously, SharePoint was dependent on a user updating their profile to say, I am familiar with the following things, development and skills and projects I've been on. And if I had put those words into my profile, people could search and find me on them. With SharePoint 2013, it'll actually take note of the fact that I might be working on documents that relate to development. So when somebody searches for development, they'll find me based on the fact that I've worked on those documents, even regardless of the fact that it's not mentioned in my user profile at all. Improved insights, so the BI story and what's happening here. Excel services can do some really neat interactive reports in 2013, and that's gotten even better than what it was over the previous version in the Office web apps. And we're also able to work with much larger sets of raw data with what's going on in Excel services now, so that we can really start to get some really big data, using the marketing term, stories going in here as well. And just overall, the search experience has been put together really, really well with SharePoint 2013. So you may have heard that previously with SharePoint 2010, there was a product called Fast for SharePoint, which was an additional search product that could be integrated into SharePoint 2010. With SharePoint 2013, there is a completely new search engine that's been built for it, which was more or less the result of taking the Microsoft search guys and the Fast search guys, locking them in a room and waiting to see what came out. And so you'll see the product, what it has now, has got features and elements of Fast, as well as the old SharePoint search in this really nice sort of hybrid, meaning that there is no separate Fast search component for SharePoint 2013. Some more questions that are just coming in at the moment. What are the main differences in like functionality between SharePoint 2010 and 2013? So sort of highlighting the main differences between 2010 and 2013 in this set of slides at the moment. Question regarding Excel services is OLAP data warehouse needed? No, any Excel workbook that you save within SharePoint 2013 can be rendered up within Excel services. And a question regarding search. Do you require external plugins like Ontolica to aid in search strength? With SharePoint 2013 with its enterprise search, I personally don't believe so, but you may find that requirements are going to vary from particular client to client as far as what their specific needs are for search. And there may still be requirements for some of these third-party products, but there has been a dramatically large improvement in what's going on in the search space for SharePoint 2013. Can we integrate SharePoint 2013 search with a SharePoint 2010 farm? Yes, you can. You can run a SharePoint 2013 search and it will be able to crawl your SharePoint 2010 content. The search results at this point are still going to be displayed within SharePoint 2013. So there's a few things you can do there around being able to crawl content outside of a farm. And a question that just came in there is, what is the most widely used and stable version of SharePoint? Most widely used at the moment is going to be 2010, purely on the basis that 2013 is still so new. As far as stable goes, they're all RTM products that are out there in the wild being used. From what I've seen with SharePoint 2013, I wouldn't call it unstable at all. SharePoint 2010 in particular, now that it's been out for a few years, is quite stable. It's had quite a few updates and performance tweaks and whatnot. But I've not seen or heard of anything to be able to say that SharePoint 2013 is not going to deliver a similar experience. Got another question around pivot tables on a dashboard where it comes from a list that will automatically update the pivot table, or will you need to press update? I believe that depends on your particular spreadsheet, but I can double check that one. I'll take that offline. Okay, continuing on. Building. So developing. This is the part we're all here for, really. So being able to create apps for the cloud was a really big focus of SharePoint 2013, right? We wanted to be able to look at what we can do to create solutions to run with essentially anywhere that SharePoint's going to run. So previously with SharePoint 2010, your solutions, unless they were a sandbox solution, were developed so that they would deploy files onto the actual server, which when you start looking at multi-tenancy scenarios, hosted things like Office 365, you obviously don't want to be deploying files out to your servers because it creates a maintenance nightmare for that many clients. So what we've got now is this app model that is going to allow us to run whatever code we want sitting on additional servers that can be anywhere. They could be separate servers within our network. They could be Windows Azure. They could even be just a separate IIS website on the same SharePoint box. But we've got this flexibility now that we can, as long as we're running a web page, be able to run our apps and have them integrated into SharePoint as tightly as any other solution that we've built previously. To back that up, we also have a new app store. So there's now a place that you can go and browse apps and be able to select and download them directly into SharePoint in much the same way as you would install an app on your phone. There's a bunch of things that's gone into that around like licensing and purchasing and that sort of thing. And for anyone who's freaking out about a million apps ending up on their farms, there's a whole lot of governance and administration tools built in around that as well. So you've got that level of control if you want it. And we've got some expanded tool support for SharePoint 2013. So we get things like our design manager, which I'll go through in a later session. And we can use basically any design tool with that to be able to work with the look and feel. But when we're creating apps, we're essentially just creating HTML and JavaScript. So we come back to being able to say, I can use whatever I feel the right tool is for the job. And that might not even be .NET. It might be that I want to go and run up some PHP-based website or something to that extent. As long as it's talking with HTML and JavaScript back to SharePoint there, it's going to be able to integrate just as tightly as anything written in .NET is, which is going to create some really interesting stories for bringing in developers who hadn't traditionally looked at SharePoint and being able to get them to create solutions. Another couple of questions. What are the main competitors of SharePoint? That sort of really depends on exactly what areas of SharePoint you're using. A couple of the big ones that turn up in that list are usually things like Lotus Notes, WebSphere, that sort of thing. But depending on which particular how you're using SharePoint, like there are search products out there to do enterprise search, there are workflow products, there are forms products. It all really depends on which areas of SharePoint you're looking at. Can I connect to SharePoint with SQL Server database? Yes, SQL Server is the default database for SharePoint. Questions, how similar is SharePoint 2013 apps to XAML Windows 8 Metro apps? Not at all. SharePoint apps are HTML based, and any of the code that you do want to write for an external app can be in any platform really, but it's as long as it spits out HTML and JavaScript, it's fine. But XAML isn't something that plays a piece in here at all. Is SharePoint 2013 based on MVC or web forms? It's still essentially the same structure as what it was in 2010, but given that we can do our app development to run outside of it, I can create an MVC app that runs inside of SharePoint and looks like it's part of SharePoint, but I can write it as a proper MVC app there. Okay, continuing on, the manage piece. So one of the things that Microsoft really put some effort into this time around was around trying to reduce running costs of SharePoint and getting the story right for the cloud. So they've obviously got a vested interest here in getting it right for their Office 365 service and getting them around being able to maintain a service that's easier, but everyone else has reaped the benefits of what they've put in there as well. So there's improved support to make it easier to run it pretty much anywhere, but the admin tools have all been beefed up as well. Managing risk is an area that they did get a lot of look in SharePoint 2013. So things like archiving, e-discovery, case management, and wrapping these sorts of features not just around SharePoint content now, but around link and exchange as well, and being able to gather content from all of those sources and be able to bring them into one place. And improvements to the infrastructure again. So there's been a lot of changes on the infrastructure side of things with SharePoint 2013 to again improve what we can do in the way of scale and working with much larger deployments and sets of data. Questions just come in is how much programming knowledge do we need to work as a SharePoint developer? You can get started with knowing just HTML and JavaScript if you're looking at the app-specific stuff. It basically comes down to trying to get your head around the SharePoint-specific parts and trying to understand how to create the best possible solutions to integrate with SharePoint. And hopefully that's something that you'll get out of this course. Question just came in, what is the main difference between .NET and SharePoint? Well, SharePoint is actually just written on .NET. It is still ASP.NET. They are one and the same pretty much. And for the labs, can I refer to Office 365 option for development? Yes, I will be talking to what we're doing in the labs and what you can do with Office 365 if you don't have access to somewhere that you can create a development environment. That's something I'll touch on later tonight. So after all that, we're now 30 minutes in here, and what do we know about what SharePoint is? It's a collaboration platform, it's a development platform, it's a web content management platform, it's a search platform, it's a workflow platform. It's a platform. We get the point here. And really it is what you want to make of it. It's what your business needs. We can build solutions to fit specific needs. We don't have to use all of SharePoint, and in fact it's generally a bad idea to go and turn on everything SharePoint does all in one go. But it does give us lots of really nice areas of functionality that we as developers can look at saying, I need workflow, authentication, and storage, and that's going to form some of the background of my solution, and it saves me having to create those particular components, and I can just use what SharePoint's giving me in that space. So ideally, that sort of gives us some options to be able to speed up the creation of a solution because we're not having to develop that base framework. We're going to use SharePoint as a platform there. So what do people use SharePoint for? So the common scenarios here are the extranets and the intranets. So people will quite often have SharePoint acting as an intranet. They're publishing documents and getting information out to their organizations, or in an extranet scenario for working with partners and bringing them into the experience and getting them going. Public-facing websites is an area that SharePoint has seen a lot of traction with. And there's a website called wssdemo.com, and I'll share the link at the end of this as well. It's done by a fellow named Ian Marsh, and what he's got is a list of known SharePoint public-facing websites, and he's put it into a neat little pivot table that lets you narrow it down by industry and country and all this sort of thing to find websites that have been done using different versions of SharePoint that are public-facing. So if you're looking for some scenarios there and some examples of what can be done, that's definitely a site worth checking out. But there are a lot of public-facing websites out there running on SharePoint. Enterprise search is something that SharePoint has done quite well in the past, and particularly now with the new sort of semi-fast integration that's going on here in the new enterprise search product. There's again some interesting stories there as far as what can be done for clients with search on its own, as well as how we as developers can take advantage of search and what it knows about all the content. Dashboards and reporting. So again, Excel services got some really big beef up in this release, and it makes it really easy for your end users to be able to create some really nice dashboards, because more often than not you're going to have people within a business who are already familiar with using Excel that can create these reports. SharePoint can now become a platform for just being able to publish them and make them accessible as a web page, and be able to get more people into viewing these data than rather than needing to go and create complex tools for it. Collaborating on projects and within teams. So again, extending with things like Project Server, which is still an add-on for SharePoint 2013, and even just the team sites and task management stuff, and I'll go through that in the demo at the end of this. But there's a lot of common uses in there. And internal applications and workflows. So people have been developing solutions and custom things for SharePoint for years now. And the story of SharePoint 2013 is that it's becoming easier to do. A lot of people are creating these customized solutions to suit specific business needs rather than taking the generic tool. And it is a very common use case to be using SharePoint like that. So questions that have just come in. Somebody's corrected me on the fact that WSS Demo has recently changed to spsdemo.com. I need to talk to Ian about that. I didn't know that, but thank you for correcting that one on me. Other questions. How does SharePoint handle WCAG 2.0 and accessibility requirements? we're actually lucky in the fact that it was just a couple of days ago that Microsoft published their compliance statements for SharePoint 2013. So they've used the standard WCAG format for a compliance statement stating that SharePoint Server 2013 is level AA compliant out of the box, the same as SharePoint 2010 was. I can dig out the links for those and get you where those are, but the compliance statements are there, the same as they were with 2010. And last question there, in dashboards and reporting, like a business intel tool, like using a cube. Yep, so SQL analysis services can be hooked up into Excel to be able to display some of that data, and then you can use that to publish up to Excel services within the web browser. Does SharePoint 2013 have better support for non-IE browsers than previous versions? Yes, it does. It has fantastic support for non-IE browsers. So there is a browser comparison chart available on TechNet that displays the different levels of support for each browser. But from what I've seen, and I'm a Firefox user day in, day out myself, IE bothers me a lot. SharePoint 2013, I haven't found anything that behaves differently. Even things like being able to drag and drop documents from the desktop onto document libraries work in Firefox and Chrome, so there's less IE-specific functionality. And what is the difference between SharePoint and Link Server? Okay, so SharePoint is the collaboration tool. Link is an instant messaging and phone and voice chat and that sort of thing. So the two tools do integrate, like you get presence information within SharePoint to let you know if somebody's online and you can start a conversation with them there. But that's what those two products are. So who's using SharePoint? Government organizations, medium and large enterprises, but interestingly enough, there's actually been a pretty big uptake in the small business sector and medium businesses around Office 365. Previously looking at the cost of spinning up servers, spinning up licenses, having SharePoint running there, for a small business, it didn't make a whole lot of financial sense. With Office 365, you've got this subscription-based model where you're paying per user per month, which makes it a much more attractive option as opposed to forking out all the cash for the infrastructure yourself if you're in the small business space. Again, more questions. What is the difference between SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint Online? Is cloud the difference here? So SharePoint 2013 is the product essentially. SharePoint Online is the Office 365 deployment of it. So if you're going to buy it through SharePoint, like I was just explaining, the great thing with SharePoint 2013 is that there are very few features missing from SharePoint Online. If you looked at Office 365 for SharePoint 2010, there was very large pieces of functionality that you couldn't get to in the SharePoint Online because it wasn't built that way. SharePoint 2013 has been built from the ground up to really focus on that cloud story, and it's close to feature parity with what you get with SharePoint Online. How easy is it to migrate existing content-intensive sites and web applications into SharePoint? Is it compatibility with different app development languages? Yep, so as I was mentioning earlier around that build slide, it is easy to create apps in other languages that can integrate into SharePoint. It's obviously going to depend on exactly what your apps do, what their requirements are, and things like that. But there is at least a bunch of scenarios where you can be looking at using things like your PHP, your Cold Fusion, anything that's going to be JavaScript based, and integrating that off into SharePoint through the APIs. And we'll talk to that in the next couple of weeks. And just regarding Office 365 and SharePoint Live, can I mention the Active Directory integration and how it works? So if you're looking at Office 365, it is possible to connect your Active Directory, your local organization's AD, and sync it with Office 365, so you can use the one set of credentials between the two. It involves using ADFS and getting the syncing to work there, and there's a bunch of settings and configuration to go into that I'm not around off the top of my head, but I can provide you with further information if you want to open a discussion in the forum about that, and we can chase down those links and get it out to you. So using different versions of SharePoint, we have three main versions of it here in SharePoint 2013. We have SharePoint Foundation. This is actually free as part of a Windows Server license. So if you've got a Windows Server 2012 license, you can go and install SharePoint Foundation for no cost at all. And what it gives you is your basic team sites. Not bad for free because it's plenty of cool stuff you can do with team sites, but it is missing a lot of that genuine SharePoint experience. The main one in the middle is SharePoint Server. So this is where we pick up a lot of the key functionality within SharePoint. But there are two different licenses there. There's the standard SharePoint license, and there is the enterprise SharePoint license. So what I've got on this slide is just a sort of general view of a few of the features that do differ across them. So, for example, you'll notice the enterprise one doesn't get all the business intelligence tools like Excel services. It doesn't get access services. Those are in the enterprise one. There is a link that is already in the portal that is pointing to editions of SharePoint that gives you a very, very detailed chart of exactly what features are in what versions. So if you're after a specific piece of functionality, you can go and figure out which license your client is going to need based on the data that's in that chart. It's also worth noting that there are different versions of SharePoint Online, and most of these are going to tie back to the different license types here, and all the detailed information is again on the Office 365 website. But there are small business specific licenses, there is government specific licenses, education licenses as well, which again they also have modified pricing on as well, so your educational organisations can bring it in cheaper. You've got your enterprise licenses for getting all the enterprise features in, but there's also external user licenses which make it easier to be able to get to partners and getting them involved in what you're doing with SharePoint Online as well. So hardware requirements for SharePoint and what we actually need to run it. So 64-bit everywhere is one of the things worth noting. So this has been the same since SharePoint 2010 in that every single server that's involved in SharePoint, including the database server, has to be a 64-bit server. Running a minimum set of services for one box, you're going to need at least 4 CPU cores and 10 gig of RAM and an 80 gig worth of hard drive space. If you're looking to run a standalone dev environment, so if ideally you want to be able to run up everything that SharePoint can do on one box and put your development tools on there as well, you're going to be looking at least 24 gig of RAM. You can generally get away with a bit less than that, but that's what Microsoft recommend, and an 80 gig worth of hard drive space. So these are the numbers off the TechNet website. The RAM is generally the figure that scares people when you're looking at a development story, in that your regular developer might be walking around with a laptop, and there's not too many laptops on the market that are going to have 24 gig of RAM up their sleeve. So, and that is an increased number on what you needed for SharePoint 2010. I've been doing SharePoint 2010 development with a laptop that's got 16 gig of RAM in it, and it's been smooth for as long as I've been using that. But the requirements for 2013 have stepped up a notch if you're going to be running a local deployment. If you're going to be looking at deploying out to a farm, again, it's going to sort of depend on how many users you've got. But generally speaking, a server at a minimum is going to be needing 12 gig of RAM as to be a server in a farm that's going to be serving up some services. So one of the things that you will need to look at is when you're trying to plan how you want to roll out SharePoint. And given that we're developers, these numbers are more just for our sort of curiosity rather than us getting involved in actually doing infrastructure work, but getting some of the numbers out there so you're aware of it. Sub 1,000 users, 64-bit, 4 cores. 1,000 to 10,000 users, your servers are going to need to step up to 8. Again, your RAM, if you're talking less than 1,000 users, you can get away with that 8 gig, but up to 10,000, you're going to need 16 gig, and more than 10,000, you'll be looking at a fairly complex infrastructure anyway. But all these numbers are taken directly from TechNet, and there's detailed articles on TechNet, and I've got a link to the requirements documentations on the portal, so you can go and look all these numbers up and get more detail around what they're doing later on. This question is, are there any recommendations on running a farm on virtual infrastructure? There's not any recommendations other than, yes, you can run SharePoint on virtualization, and it quite frequently is. I don't think I've actually seen a SharePoint deployment in recent memory that isn't running on virtual hardware. Previous versions of SQL, there was a lot of recommendations around keeping that as a physical machine, and some of the stuff with previous versions of FAST, the FAST add-on for SharePoint 2010, people recommended running that on physical rather than virtual. With SharePoint 2013, I haven't seen anything specifically that says you need to run individual pieces on physical hardware. Everything should be able to run fine in a virtual space. Is there a difference between Metro interface and Farm? I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there, but if you want to open a discussion on the forum, we can and try to flesh out the question that you've got there. So some of the architecture of what's gone on in SharePoint, and I'm sort of winding the clock back here to sort of highlight some of the differences that came in SharePoint 2010, because as developers, when we're spinning up our dev environments, it is important to have a bit of an understanding of how the infrastructure and the plumbing is working within SharePoint, so we can create solutions that are going to work with that. So this is what SharePoint 2007 looked like from an architectural standpoint. You'll see that we've got a big block on the left there for our shared service provider, which is how SharePoint serviced up things like search, Excel, user profiles, the BDC, which sat on top of our basic Windows SharePoint services for content, workflow, configuration, that sort of stuff. We've got Project, which sat at the side, and InfoPath, which sat at the side, and all of our client tools. Okay. So that was sort of how it looked at a high-level architectural view. Now, jumping forward to SharePoint 2010, this was where probably the biggest set of changes has been made in the infrastructure of what SharePoint looks like. Now, what was that shared service provider became something that's now called service applications. So now, yes, we still got Search, Excel, User Profile, and the BCS, but there was a whole lot more services added. Our PowerPoint, our Web Analytics, Visio, Access, Manage Metadata, so on and so forth. But each of these now runs as an independent application. They're no longer all tied into that group of four. So with SharePoint 2007, if you wanted search, you would also get user profiles and BDC regardless of whether or not you wanted it. Now we've got the option to run these applications up individually, get control over which servers are going to run up the services and the configurations of them, and even publish these services between farms. With the service application framework, it was also extensible so that third-party providers could create custom service applications. So the Fast tool, for example, was a custom service application. Project Server 2010 is a custom service application, and these all tie into that framework. So was the Office Web Apps in SharePoint 2010. SharePoint 2013 Office Web Apps actually need their own farm and aren't anything to do with SharePoint, but they do integrate back in. But that was sort of the main difference, was that we got the ability to run these applications up individually. Another question just came in. Do we have all these notes up online? Because my voice is going in and out apparently. Yes, all the notes of everything that I'm describing is saved within the slide deck. So if you open up the slides, then there's notes on every single slide. And if there's anything in particular that you want to be able to get, the video is being recorded and will be published with everything that's being discussed, including all the answers to the questions as we go through tonight. So the thing with the service application, the service architecture in SharePoint 2007 was that your shared service provider, so your bundle of common services, could talk to individual web apps, so individual sites within SharePoint. So you were tied to saying, well, if you're using search, this particular search, you're also using this user profile one. So we didn't have the ability to isolate those particular services out. With SharePoint 2010, the relationship between these service applications and the web apps essentially became a sort of many-to-many relationship, in that we could again get a very granular level of control over which of these service applications are going to provide functionality down to which of our sites. Which again makes it much easier to be able to scale these things out and drive them out to multiple tenants and scale the whole thing out a lot further. A couple of other questions have just come in around when will the content be published on which site. It's on the site for the course, which you should have been emailed a link for, which is on the IT Masters website. It's all in the portal there on the homepage. All the links and the slides and content it went up there earlier today, so it's all available. And for each week, we'll go up there usually the day before the lecture to be able to get a hold of all the content. Another question that just came in is, has the capacity of the content databases increased in size compared to 2010? Yes, it has gone up. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there is some documentation on TechNet as to what the capacity planning is. And James has just jumped in and given me the link. It's the learn.itmasters.edu.au is the site you should have been given the link to, and that's where all the content is if you sign in there. If you're having trouble, you can email admin@itmasters.edu.au if you don't have the details, and we'll be able to get it all sorted out for you. So installing SharePoint 2013. Depending on how exactly you're planning on using it will mean that there are a couple of minor tweaks involved in this process, but the basic flow is broken down into a couple of key steps. Is you get your prerequisites for your software and your updates, then you install the SharePoint binary files, and then you go and configure SharePoint and set it up to be able to run the way that you need it to run. So the prerequisites are actually packaged up into an installer that SharePoint is provided for you on the disk, and it'll actually reach out to the internet and download most of those prerequisites for you and run the installer and get it all ready to go. So it is pretty well taken care of. But yeah, then we go on from there to install SharePoint. So looking at creating a dev environment, so coming back to us specifically as developers and how we want to go about this, there are a couple of options for how we can go and set this up. The first option is to run it all on a single virtual machine. Basically, this means that we'll put our domain controller role, our SQL server, and our SharePoint all onto one virtual machine. That's how I've actually built up my development environment that I'll be using throughout this course and for showing you guys the content. But you also have the option that is the icon on the right here of having your domain controller and your SQL on a separate virtual machine and then having SharePoint out on its own. Both options have got a little bit of perks. The second one requires a little bit more RAM. But again, if you're looking at having minimal RAM on your development environment, having the standalone single image can make things a little bit more palatable from a hardware requirements perspective. There are a couple of little things that need to be done to get it all to run on the one box correctly, but that's all been written up in the lab guide, which is available to download on the IT Masters site there as well, which will walk you through step by step how to set up the SharePoint environment. So products that relate to SharePoint that are sort of in this space that we can look at as well. The Office web apps. So these are what let us look at and edit the Office documents within the browser. In SharePoint 2010, Office web apps was, as I mentioned earlier, a custom service application. So it would install into your SharePoint farm and it would add that functionality. With 2013, it's now actually a separate product and is a separate farm and is completely unsupported for installing on the same server as SharePoint. Long story short, it actually does all sorts of things to iOS when you install it, and it's just not at all friendly for running on anything else that's going to be serving up websites. Project Server 2013. Basically what you've got here is the same sort of thing. If it's a custom service application and will build on top of the SharePoint functionality and give you that advanced project management and integration with the project client. And also not to be forgotten is SQL reporting services. So this can still be installed to run in SharePoint mode like it has been able to for the last couple of releases, and we'll integrate the reporting services interfaces into SharePoint so that we can publish our reports up into SharePoint document libraries. So sort of wrapping up what I've been talking about in the lab here before I go off into a demo. So we've sort of hopefully introduced a bit of the topic and introduced a bit of SharePoint and the history of the product. They've done a sort of high-level talk about some of the features, and I'll go and demo them shortly. We talked about the different versions and additions, the hardware requirements and architecture, and what your sort of setup options are around the development environment and what we can do with that. So what we'll do now is we'll flick over and I'll give you guys a bit of a walkthrough of some of this. Okay, so just a question that's just come in there is, what is a farm in a nutshell? So when I talk about a SharePoint farm, essentially it's a deployment of SharePoint that will contain one or more SharePoint servers that talk to each other. So SharePoint, it is possible to have it running on just a single server, but it is also possible to run it on multiple servers with each server in the farm performing specific roles to all meet together to meet the needs of running that particular instance of SharePoint. You can do things like load balancing as well across multiple web front-end servers and all sorts of things like that. But when I say a farm, I'm referring to one or more servers that are connected that are running SharePoint. Okay, so here is a virtual machine open in my remote desktop, which is running SharePoint 2013. I've set this up based on the guide, so if you look at the lab guide, it will walk you through step by step how to go and set this up. Now, if you don't have access to hardware to be able to run this up on, there are a couple of options for still being able to go and play around with SharePoint. Your primary one is going to be Office 365. So if you're outside of Australia, you can literally just go to the Office 365 website, sign up for a trial, and I believe it's 30 days you'll get at the moment, which you'll be able to use SharePoint and Exchange and Link and all the wonderful pieces of Office 365 there, but you'll be able to play around with the kind of content that I've got set up here. If you do have access to the hardware and want to be able to set up an environment yourself, you can go and download trial versions of all of the software, so Windows Server, SQL Server, SharePoint. They're all in the evaluation centers for MSDN. I've got the links here that I'll put up into the learning site after the end of this. So you can go and download the eval versions. Those all run for 180 days by default. So you can set yourself up a dev environment, have a bit of a play around, and get yourself familiar with the tools and the products and what you're getting there. Another question that's just come in is in regards to my server configuration I mentioned, where would I install Visual Studio 2012? So for a development environment, I've got a standalone box for SharePoint that's not anywhere near my production farm, and Visual Studio goes straight on that. So you'll see if I go to my start menu down here, I've got Visual Studio installed directly onto Windows Server for doing my development. We'll touch more on the development tools specifically in next week's lecture though. So a bit of a brief rundown as to the setup I've got here. I mentioned earlier that mine is the standalone option that has everything on the one server. So going through what I've got my Active Directory and my DNS here. I've got SQL Server installed and configured on this server, and then I've also got my SharePoint products installed on here as well. Now, going through some of the first things that when we install SharePoint that we'll see is a website called Central Admin. So this is basically the main administration website for controlling what's happening in your deployment of SharePoint. It's broken down into a few key areas of application management, our system settings, our monitoring, security, backup and restore, general application settings, upgrade, apps, and a couple of out-of-the-box config wizards. Now, as far as what you need to do in Central Admin to get things set up, it is all documented in the lab guide as far as getting a basic setup up and going. If you do have any specific questions or issues or dramas with that at all, please feel free to start some discussions on the forum that we've got there. I'll be keeping a close eye on that, and we'll be jumping in to help you out as best I can. But that's essentially Central Admin. Now, looking at one of the options we've got in here is Manage Web Applications. So this is where we create the actual sites that users can browse to within SharePoint. So a web application is going to have a URL. So we can see over here I've got some URLs for some that I've set up earlier. I've got a developer site, I've got an intranet site, and I've got my sites, all with these different URLs. And within those I've created site collections and got some basic data set up. The other thing that we talked about during the lecture was the service applications and how they all work. So if I come back into application management here and go down to manage service applications, you see I get a list here of all the individual service applications that I'm running. So I've got things here like my business data connectivity, my Excel services, managed metadata, search, user profiles, Visio. They're all individual applications here that are going to provide various pieces of functionality through to SharePoint. So moving on from that and having a look at some of the actual content. So here is a SharePoint publishing site, which I've created earlier. This is my intranet example that I've set up just to be able to demo some of this. Basically, this is just one of the out-of-the-box templates, and the homepage is exactly as it is out of the box, and you'll see this when you guys go through and you create your sites there. But I've created a bunch of sub-sites, which you can see in my navigation at the top here, and we'll walk through some of these, and I'll show you some of the functionality. So this is basically one of the web content management sites. So I can do things like create additional pages and work with pages in here. So if I come up here and say I'd like to add a page to my site, for example, call it Brian's test page. A couple of quick little loading messages later, and I've got myself a new page which is ready to set content up on. I can start typing my content in there, the typical WYSIWYG style of editor, go format it, do whatever I want to do with it, and save my page when I'm done, and here it is. I get messages with things like telling me the page is checked out to me and only I can see it, and gives me options of what I can do with that. I can click up the top here to get my ribbon, so anyone who's been using the Office client applications is going to have a very familiar experience for what they're going to be doing with SharePoint and working with things. One of the other areas of SharePoint that's been in there since SharePoint 2003 is the concept of web parts. So a web part is sort of like a type of widget almost that can be put onto a page that does a specific piece of functionality. If I go into my Insert tab up here, in amongst all the various things that I can insert, so I can insert a web part. Now you see, out of the box, we get a fairly large number of these that all do various sorts of things. I might just decide that I want to insert a list of documents that I've got in this site. And there's currently no documents in the site, so it tells me that, but it's now that little block sitting inside of my page that users can now do things with and be able to see that the content's there. Developing custom web parts is one of the easiest ways to extend SharePoint and do it in such a way that users are going to be able to easily take these parts of functionality that we're building and put them onto pages. Questions just come in is, if we start with a SharePoint Foundation installation, is it easy to add features from standard or enterprise after user or management buy-in? SharePoint Foundation to SharePoint Server, I'm not so sure about. I don't think there is a supported in-place upgrade there, but you can literally take the content databases and drop them onto a SharePoint Server installation. To go from SharePoint Server to SharePoint Enterprise, there is an inbuilt way of being able to just change the product key and go and activate the enterprise features, and doing that is quite simple. Another question that's just come in is, are web parts being deprecated in Microsoft's eyes? There's been no official statements. Web parts are still very much alive and kicking, and there has been some investment in the web part framework specifically around apps, in that you can create essentially an external web part that is going to be a HTML-based page, but it will still look and feel and act to the user exactly like a standard web part. We'll go over those client-side web parts in week 4 when we're talking about the apps, but no, web parts are definitely not being deprecated as far as Microsoft are concerned. So, we've got our document web part on our page, and you can see that we've got pages there to edit, and it's all fine and dandy and does some stuff. Is I can go and upload some documents into that site, for example. So I can go in here and say site contents. And it's just going to show me everything that's in this site. So I've got a document library, an image library. These are all places that I can save documents. I've got specific lists of reports and reusable content where I can store additional data. I can create new lists and new libraries by using the Add an App button. So in SharePoint 2013, all of these lists and libraries are referred to as apps now. Everything is an app, which is a little confusing if you've come from previous versions of SharePoint where you just say, I want to create a list or a library, but no, that document library is now an app that you can add. But any other apps that you do download or install will also appear on this screen as well. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into my document library and just show you a little bit about how that works. So I got a very basic list of my documents here. As I can say I want to create a new document. And now it asks me if I want to go and upload one. I've also got the option of creating one from scratch here with Word. So I can open Word, create a document, generate some random text, and save it into my current folder. I'm going to close that now and refresh my page. And you can now see I've got my document here ready to be able to work with. So it's saved into SharePoint. One of the changes in 2013 is this little pop-up menu that we get next to each of these documents, which gives us this fairly sort of simplified view as to what's going on with an individual document or list item. So this is all, the URL there. I've got the option to edit it. I can say I want to share it and type in the names of people that I want it to be able to see it. I can choose to follow it, which I'll go into in a little bit as to some of the social features there, and then I've got my full list of things I can do with that document as well. Questions just come in there, a couple of them. Are custom web parts specific to a SharePoint site, or can they be shared among other SharePoint sites on the same server? I'll go into web part deployment in week 3, specifically when we're going into the web part stuff. You can deploy a web part to the server and then choose which individual sites it can and can't be used on. So we'll go through that in week 3 in detail. Is the site collection on work? Is that a site collection I'm working on right now? Yes, this is one of the out-of-the-box site collections that I've created on my local deployment here. This is based on the publishing site collection template. Why do we need to develop in SharePoint? It seems that everything we need is already there, is one of the questions, and this actually raises a very good point. One of the things of being a SharePoint developer is through knowing when not to write code, which is why I wanted to start this first week with a show of what SharePoint does out of the box. In that you do actually get quite a lot, and there is a lot you can get just by configuring it and tweaking it through the UI. There are still plenty of scenarios where you're going to want to be able to develop custom things, particularly around workflow stories, around customizing public-facing websites, around integrating external data and doing more advanced things with that. There are still plenty of stories that are going to require custom development. But again, there are a lot of times I've gone out to client sites and I look at things that have been done by people who haven't been quite aware of everything that SharePoint does and have built something similar to what can be done out of the box if they knew it was there. But no, that is a very good question. And are the labs referring to SharePoint Server or an enterprise install, or is Foundation enough? So the labs that I'm demoing on here are using the enterprise install of SharePoint, which is what you'll get if you download the eval or sign up for an Office 365 trial. As far as what's been gone through in the short course, you should be able to get away with SharePoint Foundation, actually, because we were doing web part development, we were doing app development. These are all things that are supported by Foundation. I will go and double check that and just review what I'm going over for the next couple of weeks, but Foundation should cut it if you're interested in doing that. Can we create user controls, like an ASCX file in SharePoint, or do we create them outside of Visual Studio and import them? So one of the things we can do with web parts is create what's called a visual web part, where we literally get an ASCX control and we develop against that and then integrate it into SharePoint as a web part. We'll go through that in week 3 when we're looking specifically at web parts though. Am I using Windows authentication for my account here, which is admin guy? Yes. So the authentication in SharePoint 2013 is all claims-based, but the web apps I've set up are all Windows authentication. And because my site is in the local intranet zone, it's just automatically logging me onto the site as I browse to it. But yes, it is all Windows NTLM authentication. So moving on. So we can work with documents, we can chuck documents in, and we have our sites. But let's go through a couple of the other sites here. So up the top here, I've got a team site. So this, again, is one of the other templates for SharePoint, and you'll notice that very much so looks different to what the publishing site did. We get these neat little links here on being able to go through, and I want to customize my site. So I might decide, hey, let's change the look and feel, and let's go for, I don't know, say that one. So I get a much better experience out of the box for being able to tweak some of these experiences with SharePoint and customize the branding a little. Oh, it looks kind of funky. Let's go with that. And, let's try that out. SharePoint can build a little preview for me. Do I like what I see on my site? Sure, let's keep that. And I've gone and customized the way the site looks. So the team sites are a very bread and butter style site. They're what you get in SharePoint Foundation, and they're basically built around being able to store lists of information and storing your documents. So you can see down here I've got my example document. One of the things that we can do with SharePoint 2013 that I do enjoy showing off a bit is if I go and create myself a new Word document or something like that on my desktop, now get the ability to natively drag and drop to upload into SharePoint, which usually gets a lot of wows when I'm demoing this in front of a live audience. I'm just going to assume that everybody's nodding their heads and smiling at that one. But that's not browser specific, so that does work in Firefox, and I've seen it work in Chrome. So we can just drag and drop content to be able to upload into SharePoint quite easily there. Another question that's just come in regarding when not to create custom SharePoint 2013. Is it safe to say that SharePoint 2013 out of the box can meet about 80% of an average client's customization requirements? That really depends on what your client is trying to do. But yeah, generally speaking, the SharePoint can get you quite a large way towards meeting a specific customer's goals, and using custom development is going to be able to fill in those last gaps and meet requirements that aren't quite there out of the box yet. Do I have a definitive list of web parts available in SharePoint 2013 out of the box and to save developing something that already exists? That is a very good question. I'm not sure if there is something published, but what we can do, if I go back to my intranet page, is I can go into my site settings, and under my galleries here I've got what's called a web part gallery. So what this does is it gives me a list of web parts that this specific site is aware of, 30 of them at a time in this view, and it tells me the web part file, and I can go in and click on the web part, and in the case of a web part that stands on its own without any other settings, it'll give me a preview of it here. So based on the type of site you've created and the features that are turned on, and we'll talk more about features and web parts over the next couple of weeks and how they work, that's not a bad place to start for getting a list. I will see if I can chase up a known list of web parts out of the box, but I'm not sure if that's actually published on MSDN or not. Is SharePoint's workflow tech based on the .NET one, and can you integrate other workflows like PowerShell, for example? I'm not quite sure PowerShell relates to workflow at all, but yes, the workflow engine inside of SharePoint is based on .NET. There are multiple workflow engines in .NET, and in the full version of this course, when we run it, there is a whole week that we're dedicating to workflow. The two workflow engines are your common .NET one, which is based on the standard .NET workflow runtime, and there's also Windows Azure workflow engine, which is going to be able to be used in the cloud scenario as well as some on-premise stuff. But yeah, the out-of-the-box .NET workflow is there. If you've been developing workflows on Windows Workflow Foundation before, it's the exact same tooling. There's just some SharePoint-specific actions that can be dragged onto the workflows. Okay, so moving on, other types of sites, the wiki site. So this gives me a relatively basic wiki that I can go and work with, and I can choose to create new pages in much the same way. So it all looks the same as the publishing site, but I get a slightly different layout of the page here. I do get some wiki syntax in that if I type double brackets, I get my list of pages here and can create a link like that. So we do get some wiki behavior that is baked into SharePoint there, but again, it's largely based on being able to create content and publish content and work with that sort of thing. Next, we've got a blog site. So again, this is another one of the out-of-the-box templates that is provided by SharePoint, and we can go and create a very basic blog. I can do things like managing the categories for my posts. I can have comments. So here's a post I made earlier, and I could say, well, let's come in here, and this is great, and post my comments on there. And so we get a relatively useful blogging engine out of the box without going to need and install a separate product to do the blogging. We also get the ability to create new posts within the browser, title, body, category, all fairly boring looking interface. Or I can actually say launch a blogging app, in which case Microsoft Word can open for me. And I can say, here's my post title. And I can still manage things like the categories. So insert a category. And then go and publish that directly into SharePoint. Yep, save it. I don't need to save the Word document, that's fine. So now when I go back to my blog, there's a post that I've created within Microsoft Word as the authoring tool. You can use Windows Live Writer as well but there's a few other tools that you can tie in for that, but it makes it really easy to get people in and blogging on SharePoint. Another question that's just come in is can we migrate SharePoint 2010 to 2013? Yes, you can migrate 2010 to 13. There is a lot of documentation on TechNet around the processes for that, and I could quite happily talk for another couple of hours on how you're going to do that, but the really short answer is that you build a new 2013 farm and you migrate your content databases across. Question, are there any prerequisites for this course? All the information on the full course, any prerequisites and that sort of thing is on the Charles Sturt website, and I would refer you to that to have a look for any of the information you need there. Can one create a CMS or blogger application that can be marketed commercially by using SharePoint but sell it as a standalone product? I'm honestly not sure. You could probably create a custom site that was to do blogging things that ran on SharePoint, but you would still require SharePoint as the actual sort of engine there. Does SharePoint have its own user accounts like the complex 2010 version, or does it rely only on Active Directory? I'm not quite sure what was going on in the 2010 version that was overly sort of complex. SharePoint does still have a user profile service, and that is much more stable in SharePoint 2013 from what I've seen for anyone who's had issues with the user profile service. But we can discuss that offline because we're sort of getting to a point where we're running out of time. Are 2010 web parts compatible, or do they need to be modified? No, they should work out of the box, but again, worth checking into before you go to production, but there's assembly binding redirections that should click into place there. And again, another question, can I get the video? Yes, it will be published afterwards. So quickly rushing through some of the last things I wanted to show you guys. There's a community site. So this is essentially a new type of site for SharePoint 2013, which is around creating discussions and forums and whatnot. So this is my question and stuff, and I can tell SharePoint that it is a question specifically. So here's one I've created earlier. Is SharePoint a good WCM tool? You'll see at the top here it's got this thing called best reply. As the person who asked the question, you can actually come in and say which post answers a question. So that way if somebody sees the question, they also get notified of the answer straight away here. This is great because it actually then ties off into search. Whereas if I go and search for WCM, come on, go over here and do it. While that's loading, I'll answer another question. What is the difference between SharePoint Developer and SharePoint Admin? Once we've completed this course, will we be able to work as an admin too? No, this course is focusing specifically on the development. There is a whole lot of stuff to go with the admin side of SharePoint as well that won't get covered here. Okay, so here's my search results, and you can actually see that as I go over them, I get a little pop-up preview. But what I can actually see here is my answer and the original post, all in the scope of the search results. So the story around discussion boards and whatnot in SharePoint 2013 is much more interesting than it has been previously. Okay, so going back into other sites, I've got a project site to show you just quickly, which uses a new sort of Gantt chart style view of being able to visualize tasks. So this all backs off into a regular task list, which I can then click on here and say, here's my task, and go and open it and see how many days it's due in, but it's just a regular task. Other things worth seeing, my site. So if I go to About Me, you'll see here's my site, and my profile, and my newsfeed. So if you're familiar with Facebook or any of these sort of social things, there are a lot of commonalities here in that I've got a newsfeed, and I can go and see anything to do with people or documents or content that I'm following. So I can flag sites or people or documents as things that I'm interested in, and whenever they come up within SharePoint anywhere, they'll turn up in my newsfeed. So I can choose to follow a particular site or a hashtag or something like that and have that content appear for my newsfeed here, so that way I can keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on with the things that I'm interested in. So that's about the extent of the things that I sort of wanted to show you guys from a end user perspective of getting into SharePoint. Now, There is, like I said, there's a lab guide that's going to walk you through how to build a SharePoint site, and one of the things I mentioned in there is being able to restore a backup. So what I'm actually doing is taking just this individual site collection, and I'll upload it into the portal there so that you guys can download it and restore it if you're running your own site up. Otherwise, go to the Office 365 website, sign up for a trial, and just get yourself familiar with the product and what it can do. There are a number of links in the portal to additional content and additional reading around some of the things I discussed during the lecture, and there's also another webinar put together by Microsoft in there around some more details of what SharePoint does, and also links to some case studies of people that are using SharePoint 2013 at the moment that are worth reading to get your head around some of the people that are actually using SharePoint at the moment. Last couple of questions to spin this through and round it out. What are the differences? Sorry, I answered that one already. What's the minimum dev spec? Okay, and my microphone decided to mute itself, but it appears to be back. Was the minimum dev spec box? So I mentioned that in the slides. You'd sort of really like to have at least sort of 24 gig of RAM. You could probably get away with 16. My particular dev environment here, I'm running on 24 as the virtual machine, having 24 allocated to it. My host has got 32. But that's what I'm running this with. You can try it with less. Just be prepared to suffer some slower performance. Is my blog created with SharePoint? At the moment, no, it's not. I do have plans to move it to SharePoint, but at the moment it's running on a custom .NET engine. Do you have my contact details? So the best way to get in touch with me is going to be through the discussion boards in the portal, and also messaging me through there. I will be keeping a very close eye on what's going on through there. And quad-core processor, yes, that is a recommended CPU. So one of the Intel i5s or i7s, the quad cores. But yes, that is one monster dev machine I have. So on that note, I'm going to wrap this up because we've gone a few minutes over where we were aiming to. I hope you guys have been able to learn something out about exactly what SharePoint is before we get into the really heavy development stuff in the next couple of weeks. Please do get into the discussion boards. I'm keen to talk to you guys and make sure that you get something out of this, and really be able to take something away from this short course. So I'm very happy to engage with you guys as much as possible, and otherwise thank you guys for making the time to attend the lecture, and keep an eye on that portal. Thank you very much.